I had never been the kind to believe in ghost stories. Sure, I'd watched the movies, but horror felt distant to me, like fiction dressed up for thrills and jumps. Well, it all changed during a business trip I took last year, a trip that led me to a hotel just off the beaten path of an ordinary city in the Midwest. To anyone else, it was just an aging, budget-friendly chain hotel on the edge of a slowly deteriorating neighborhood. But for me, that stay became something I'd spend sleepless nights trying to understand and shake off. When I arrived, the front desk clerk barely looked at me as she checked me in, muttering the usual pleasantries while typing with a speed that implied she'd done it 1,000 times before. She handed me the key, a slim plastic card printed with the hotel's logo, and told me, almost too quietly, that my room would be on the 5th floor. Room 515. The elevator clanked as I ascended, each floor marked by a small jolt, as if it struggled to remember its own job. When the doors slid open on the 5th floor, the corridor stretched out before me, far longer than I'd expected. The dim lighting and faint smell of stale carpet gave it an abandoned feel, and I got the first pang of unease. It was empty, eerily quiet, with rows of closed doors on either side, each indistinguishable from the next except for their brass numbers. I dismissed the feeling, though brushing it off as post-travel fatigue. I found my door, swiped the card, and pushed it open. The air inside felt oddly still, colder than the rest of the hotel, even though the AC was off. I switched on the lights, expecting the comforting brightness of a hotel room, but they only flickered to life dimly, casting a pale yellow glow. The room was basic, old but clean enough. There was a faint, lingering smell of something. Sharp, almost metallic, but I told myself it was just the old carpet, or maybe the drapes, and I had work to do. So I unpacked my laptop, set up at the small desk, and tried to ignore the unsettling quiet that seemed to press in from every corner. As I worked, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I kept glancing back at the room's corners, my eyes drawn to the closet near the bed. Its door was cracked open, just a sliver, barely noticeable, but enough that I could see into the darkness within. It seemed innocuous, yet the sight of it triggered something deep, a primal discomfort that I couldn't rationalize. I got up, walked over, and closed it firmly, telling myself it was just my imagination. When night came, I got ready for bed, hoping the odd tension would melt away after a good night's sleep. But as I lay there, the silence grew louder, and that feeling of being watched returned with full force. I told myself it was just paranoia, but there was something different, like a weight in the room pressing on me, something just out of sight. I couldn't place it, but it was there, shifting and heavy in the air. I turned over to face the wall, determined to fall asleep, but after a few minutes I heard the sound. It started as a soft scratching, coming from somewhere near the closet. I tensed, listening, telling myself it was just the building settling. But then, it happened again, faint, deliberate, as if someone, or something, was scratching the inside of the closet door. I sat up, heart pounding, and looked over. The door was closed, just as I'd left it. After a few moments, the scratching stopped, leaving me alone with the silence once more. The next morning, I felt drained, as if I hadn't slept at all. The memory of that scratching clung to me, and I almost convinced myself I'd dreamed it. But when I went to the lobby to ask about switching rooms, the clerk barely looked up. "Full house," she said curtly, already turning back to her computer. I tried to argue, but she was firm. Left without any other option, I spent the day trying to stay out as long as possible, working from cafes, and finding any excuse to avoid the hotel. Still, I knew I'd have to go back eventually. When I returned that night, something felt wrong, like the atmosphere itself had shifted. The air was thick, almost suffocating, and the hallway lights seemed dimmer, casting long shadows that stretched out as I walked. My skin prickled with an unnatural chill as I reached my room, and I hesitated before swiping my keycard, almost afraid of what I'd find inside. The room was as I'd left it, but that metallic smell had grown stronger, more pungent, as if it had been locked in and allowed to stew all day. I set my bags down and noticed something that made my blood run cold. The closet door was slightly ajar. I was certain I'd closed it before leaving, but now it stood open just a crack, revealing the sliver of darkness within. I froze, a surge of instinctive dread making me want to leave, but some strange pull kept me rooted in place. With a deep breath, I approached the closet, my heart hammering in my chest. Slowly, I opened it wider, revealing nothing but darkness and the stale scent of old, untouched fabric. There was nothing inside, no sign of anything unusual. But when I closed it and turned away, I felt the distinct sensation of something behind me. I spun around, but I was alone, staring into the empty, silent room. I tried to sleep again, but as soon as I closed my eyes, the scratching resumed. It was louder this time, more insistent, like something desperate was clawing to get out. I lay frozen in bed, listening to the relentless noise, a cold sweat drenching me as the minutes stretched into hours. At some point, exhaustion finally won, and I drifted into a restless sleep. The next morning, I'd had enough. I packed my bags and went straight to the front desk, demanding to speak with the manager. The clerk's disinterested expression shifted slightly when I mentioned my room number. She leaned in, her voice lower than before. "Room 515. They don't put people there much anymore," she murmured, as if revealing a secret she wasn't supposed to share. When I pressed her, she shrugged, feigning ignorance, but her gaze flickered nervously. I left with my bags, promising myself I'd never return. But as I walked out, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, as if something unseen was following me, silently urging me never to come back. Since then, I've read about strange occurrences at other hotels, unexplained noises and cold spots. But room 515 remains an unspoken mystery I'll never fully understand. The memories of those restless nights haunt me, the scratches, the shadows, and that lingering, watching presence, filling my mind with questions that may never have answers. I can't explain what happened in that room, but I've learned that some places carry their own darkness, hidden behind closed doors, waiting for someone to stumble upon them. I never thought I'd be the kind of person to get tangled up in a ghost story. I'm the skeptic, the one who needs facts and figures, logic over superstition. So when my boss booked me into this small, out-of-the-way hotel for a conference, I didn't give it a second thought. It was an old place, one of those classic hotels from the 1920s, built high on a hill outside a small town. The reviews were decent enough, and it looked picturesque in a rustic way, with faded photos in the lobby, showing its history as a once popular retreat. The conference itself was exhausting, and by the time I checked in, it was late. The lobby was empty, except for a tired-looking front desk clerk who handed me my key. Room 407. I remember thinking it was odd to have an actual key instead of a key card. It was heavy, attached to a tarnished brass tag with the room number engraved in a flowery font. The hallways were dimly lit, stretching far down each floor and carpeted with worn, muted colors that dulled any noise. It was one of those old-school hotels where the hallways seemed too long, making you feel like you were walking miles just to reach your room. Finally, I reached my door, twisted the key, and pushed it open. The room was simple, old-fashioned, but clean. I noticed a faint smell, a mixture of dust and stale perfume, the kind of scent that clings to old places. I dismissed it and unpacked quickly, barely glancing at the furnishings of bed, an old wardrobe, and a vanity with a cracked mirror above it. The wallpaper was peeling slightly at the edges, and there was a faint yellow stain in one corner of the ceiling. None of it was out of the ordinary for a hotel of this age, I figured. As I was settling in, I felt an odd chill, a draft that seemed to come out of nowhere. I checked the windows, they were closed tight. Shrugging it off, I tried to relax, scrolling through my phone before finally deciding to call it a night. I left a small lamp on beside the bed, not because I was scared, but because I wasn't used to the room's unsettling darkness. The first strange thing happened around midnight. I was drifting off when I heard a distinct, steady tapping sound, like someone was knocking softly on the wall near my head. Tap, tap, tap. It was rhythmic, almost deliberate, but I lay still, half asleep, trying to ignore it, but the noise didn't stop. I sat up, heart racing, and strained to listen. The tapping seemed to come from within the wall, right behind the headboard. I tried to dismiss it as the hotel settling, or maybe an old pipe. I turned over, burying my head in the pillow, and tried to sleep again. But the tapping continued, and then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. Relief washed over me, but it didn't last. Not even a few minutes later, I heard a faint creaking sound coming from the wardrobe. Well, the door was closed, but I could swear I heard movement, the subtle groan of wood under pressure. My stomach twisted, but I told myself it was nothing, just an old wardrobe in an old hotel. Somehow I managed to fall asleep, but it wasn't restful. All night, my dreams were filled with strange, shadowy figures and empty hallways that stretched on forever. At one point, I jolted awake, certain someone was watching me. The room was empty, of course, but the feeling of being watched lingered. I lay there, wide-eyed, staring at the ceiling, and eventually drifted back into a shallow, uneasy sleep. The next morning, I tried to brush it off. It was just a bad night in a strange place, I told myself. After a quick shower, I noticed something peculiar. The bathroom mirror was fogged up from the steam, and there on the glass was what looked like a faint handprint. Well, it was too large to be my own, and too distinct to be a smudge from cleaning. I wiped it away, unsettled, and finished getting ready. Throughout the day, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. When I returned to the hotel that evening, I almost asked for another room but felt silly. I was an adult, I couldn't let a few creaks and taps get to me. So I headed back to room 407, determined to ignore any odd noises. Well, that night was worse. Around the same time, the tapping started again, but this time it was louder, more insistent. My nerves were on edge as I lay there, listening. I kept telling myself it was just pipes, or maybe even another guest, but deep down I didn't believe it. The air felt heavy, thick with something I couldn't name. Then, around 3 a.m., I heard something that stopped me cold. It was a whisper, soft but clear, coming from the direction of the wardrobe. I couldn't make out words, but the tone was unmistakable, a low, murmuring voice, almost like someone talking to themselves. I froze, my pulse pounding in my ears, as the whispering continued, growing faint, then louder, then faint again, like whoever or whatever was in there was pacing back and forth. I wanted to leave, to run out of that room and not look back, but I couldn't move. I lay there, paralyzed by a fear I'd never felt before. After what felt like an eternity, the whispering stopped and silence fell. I stayed awake until dawn, too terrified to even close my eyes. The next morning I was done. I packed up, intending to check out early, conference or not. As I was grabbing my things, I noticed something odd on the vanity. There, etched faintly into the wood, were letters, as if someone had scratched them in long ago. "Don't stay." My blood ran cold. I hadn't seen the message when I arrived, and I was certain I would have noticed it. The words were faint, almost like they'd been hidden until now, revealing themselves only after 2 nights of sleepless terror. I didn't wait around. I checked out, giving a weak excuse to the front desk clerk about a family emergency. She gave me a knowing look, one that seemed almost too familiar with the routine. I wondered then if room 407 had a reputation, if the hotel staff knew about its unsettling occupants, and chose to keep quiet. I left that place, feeling a strange mix of relief and dread. Relief to be gone, dread at the lingering feeling that something, or someone, had watched me those 2 nights, had whispered to me, had waited, maybe, for something more. I've stayed in countless hotels since then, always careful to pick newer, brighter places with none of the old-world charm that once seemed so appealing. And every time I check in, I make sure to avoid rooms with strange histories or hidden warnings. I know, logically, that it was probably nothing, just an old hotel with creaky floors and thin walls. But sometimes, late at night, I remember that whispering voice and wonder if it was ever really just the room. I'd never been the type to believe in bad vibes, but that changed one night in a small, off-brand hotel on the outskirts of Cleveland. It was a work trip, and I was just looking for somewhere to crash after a long drive. The hotel wasn't flashy, it was plain, unremarkable, but affordable, and I figured one night wouldn't hurt. When I arrived, the front desk clerk, a guy about my age, with thinning hair and a tight smile, barely glanced at me as he handed over the key. He looked worn out, with dark circles under his eyes like he hadn't slept in days. I couldn't shake this odd feeling, something hard to put into words, but I brushed it off. After all, who's really on their best game during the night shift? My room was on the 3rd floor, at the end of a long, dimly lit hallway. As I walked, I could feel my footsteps echoing behind me, like someone was pacing right along. When I glanced back, of course, no one was there. Just my nerves, I thought, blaming it on exhaustion. Inside, the room looked fine, if a little dingy. The wallpaper was faded, and the heavy curtains cast a strange, muted light over everything. But as I went to lock the door behind me, something seemed off. Well, the deadbolt was busted, like it had been forced open before and never properly repaired. I hesitated, considering asking for a different room. But I convinced myself I was being paranoid. One night, that was all. I unpacked a few things, checked my emails, and then settled in bed to get some sleep. Just as I was drifting off, I thought I heard something, a faint scraping sound. It seemed to come from the hall, but each time I got close to the door, it stopped. So I went back to bed and tried to ignore it. But then I heard it again, right outside my door, like someone dragging their hand along the wall. I froze. The scraping continued, dragging slowly along the wall by my door, moving downward until it stopped just outside my room. There was a pause, and then I heard a low, rhythmic tapping against the door, just barely audible. I was wide awake now, heart pounding as I strained to listen. The tapping went on for what felt like forever, until it suddenly stopped. My whole body was tense as I listened for more. But the silence was absolute. Whoever was out there had gone. I stayed up, scrolling mindlessly on my phone, trying to shake off the unease. After about an hour, I finally managed to fall asleep, clutching my bag beside me like a kid with a security blanket. I woke up sometime later to the sound of the door handle jiggling. Someone was trying to get into my room. I bolted upright, heart racing, as the handle twisted back and forth, followed by a soft, almost polite knock. I crept over to the door and looked through the peephole. It was the clerk from the front desk, standing there with that strange, tight smile on his face. His eyes looked tired, hollow, and something about him seemed. I called out, "Can I help you?" but he didn't answer. He just stared straight ahead, that smile never fading, hand on the doorknob. After a few seconds, he turned and walked down the hall, disappearing around the corner. I should have felt relieved, but something about it sent a chill down my spine. The next morning, I went to the front desk to check out and decided to ask about the night clerk. "That guy working last night, he looked exhausted," I said, hoping to play it off casually. The woman behind the counter frowned. "You mean Brian? He didn't have a shift last night. He hasn't worked here in months. Had a break, I guess you could say." She lowered her voice. "Something got to him, they say. Went off one night and tried to break into a guest's room. No one knows why. He's not supposed to be around here anymore." Well, I left without asking anything else, my skin crawling. As I stepped outside, I glanced back at the hotel. It looked completely ordinary, just a boxy building with faded paint. But I knew I'd never stay there again. And even now, I can't shake the feeling of those cold eyes on me through the door, the silent, haunting presence of a man whose mind had shattered, lingering in that empty hallway.